from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Eric Westin in Washington on the whistleblower's letter to President Trump, and for that matter, a second conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine. So, Eric, welcome. Let's start with what the president told us about just today. This second conversation actually happened first, as I understand it, back in April.
That's right. There was an initial conversation between President Zelensky after he was elected and President Trump, and that has been mentioned in several of the witness testimony transcript. And Trump is saying he'd be willing to release that. Now, we don't know if he's cleared that with Zelensky. Zelensky, in fact, was quite surprised when the initial transcript came out and his side was printed. It caused him some diplomatic problems with the EU. Trump also on the White House South Lawn was saying that pardon me, a bit of a cough here. He's against the idea of having public hearings. This is really in contradiction to the GOP messaging, which for weeks has called for public hearings in the wake of Adam Schiff's private testimony taking in the deep bunker in the Capitol.
Yeah, Eric, I found that fascinating, actually, because we'd heard from the Republican after Republican, this is so unfair because it's not in public. Now it's not clear that President Trump really wants it in public after all.
I know. The Republican messaging has been all over the map on this. Lately, they've been congealing around the idea that Mick Mulvaney, Sondland, and the other lower people in the State Department came up with this scheme at Ukraine on their own. We've heard that a lot from Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, the House Freedom Caucus members who are Trump's chief defense members here and lawmakers on the Hill. They're basically saying they presumed there was a quid pro quo. They presumed there was a tie between the aid and this investigation into the Bidens, that Trump had nothing to do with that. We'll see if that flies in the public hearing is set for next week.
Well, it's interesting you point that out, Eric, because I noticed in the Bill Taylor transcript of his behind the closed doors testimony, he said he didn't know that the president really was responsible for this. He knows that Rudy Giuliani was, but he didn't know whether the president was directly implicated. Could that be part of a defense by the White House that if something bad happened, it wasn't the president himself?
Yeah, it seems to be they're trying to look for some plausible deniability there. The Democrats keep coming back to that transcript where Trump says, do us a favor, though, and they say that it's implausible for the public to believe that these directions weren't coming from the very top. Okay,
thank you very much to Eric Westin reporting from Washington. Capitol Hill, actually, was where he's reporting from. And now let's turn to Brexit editor Edward Evans. He's over in London. So, Edward, at least as we read it over here, it sounds like Prime Minister Johnson is having a little tough time getting his campaign going over there. A few glitches along the way.
You could say that, and that would be putting it mildly. I think this has been a week for both parties that both parties would rather forget. The Tory campaign's been hit by resignations, serving minister to resign during a general election in more than 100 years, and gaffes. Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that the 72 people who died in a tower block fire in 2017 hadn't exercised what he called common sense. Equally, on the Labour side, they've been hit by resignations too. Tom Watson, deputy leader, resigning, and allegations of anti-Semitism ingrained in the Labour Party. So really a week to forget, frankly, for both major political parties here.
One of the things that struck me is, as I understand, some senior members of government got stuck on a train platform. They couldn't get back to London, which you'd say, well, that's just inconvenient. But it does raise the question of, should the trains be privatized the way Maggie Thatcher did it? Or do they want to go back to the public sphere the way, as I understand, Jeremy Corbyn thinks they should do it?
Well, if I may correct you there, Maggie never privatised the railways. It was the one privatisation that even she shied away from. It was her successor, John Major, who did that.
Well done. I got it wrong. Good for you. Thank you.
But it is an experience that many British commuters will be all too familiar with. And as an image of a campaign, a vignette that sort of sums up how the campaign is going to find half the British cabinet on the platform at Birmingham International on a dark night. It just shows you that in one place really sums up this is a campaign that's not running on the tracks at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. A bit snake bit over there. So thank you very much, and thanks for that clarification. I always thought it was Maggie Thatcher. Thank you. That's Edward Evans. He is our Brexit editor reporting from London. And now let's bring in Damien Shaw of Bloomberg Intelligence on the latest trade headlines. And Damien, it was fascinating. The markets were doing pretty well, and then President Trump went out in the White House and said, you know what? I'm not so enthusiastic about this rollback of tariffs.
Well, everybody was kind of suspecting that the U.S. was eerily quiet throughout it all. But I mean, just looking back over overnight and looking at some of the trade data, I mean, what's most impressive to me about this export data, and it came in stronger than expected, as I'm sure you're aware, was the negative base effect. I mean, if you just look back to October of 2018, I mean, exports were up 14.8%. So it was that much harder for them to beat expectations this time around, and yet they did it, you know, only falling 9.9% relative to down 3.9% year over year. But, you know, that has a large part to do with the EU and the Southeast Asian region really picking up the slack for, you know, U.S. exports declining. And really what it tells me is, you know, look, if you just look at the PBOC, they set the fix below 7 for the very first time in as long as I can remember since we broke through the psychological 7 handle. And if you just look at yesterday's MSCI just announced they're going to be adding a whole bunch of A shares into the EM index. It's going to take, you know, A shares weight up to 4.1%. So you should see some positive momentum on the back of capital flows coming into the country off that.
It leads to the question, actually, is China trading as an emerging market at this point?
No, not at all. No, I mean, you know, it's funny, the definition of an emerging market, you and I have gone back about this before, but China's not an emerging market. Nevertheless, you know, I guess people try to put it in that bucket. I think for me, you know, it's really going to be about seeing manufacturing bottom in China in order for us to see, you know, a real kind of green shoots sort of occurring there. And, you know, if you just look at the PBOC, I think they're kind of extending themselves a bit here. They're cutting rates there. They've lowered the LPR. They've lowered the MLF. I mean, so, you know, they still realize there are real problems at home and they need to stimulate their economies. So,
fascinating.
Yeah.
Damien Shaw, always great to have you with us, Damien. Thank you very much. And now let's check in on those markets and see how they're reacting to the top stories from today. Joining us, Abigail Doolittle. So as I sort of got ahead of myself here, but looking at the chart, I think it's kind of right. The markets really took a hit when President Trump said not so fast on rolling back the tariffs.
They did take a small leg lower, but in the perspective of small moves, so it actually, right now, we're barely moving on any of the major averages. But yes, we did take a little leg lower because it was President Trump saying that the rollbacks that folks had been expecting, the U.S. has not, in fact, agreed to. So it's a continuation of the trade narrative where one day or 1 week it's bullish for the markets, and then the next week it's neutral or could even turn bearish. Until we have a deal, there is no deal. I think that that's something that we can safely assume. But investors, based on the fact that stocks are basically flat, the S&P 500 on pace for its 5th up week in a row, they're probably a little bit more constructive around the possibility of a deal than not.
So, as you say, we could go up and down and all around about this trade thing. We've been doing it forever, right?
Yes.
But give me something else that could drive the markets, because we're sort of through the earnings season for the most part now. Can't look forward to those anytime soon. Well, if the markets have to have something else to trade off of, what's it going to be?
Well, you know, I think it's still related to earnings in a way, because this earnings season was better than feared. A small earnings recession, the third down quarter for earnings in a row. But the expectation is going ahead, we're probably going to come out of that earnings recession. So for that reason, investors may be willing to put some money in the game, put some skin in the game, and buy stocks. Plus the Fed, there's just this sense that the Fed has got investors back, or the investing community's back, and cruise control.
So let me go off script and maybe be unfair.
Yeah.
How correlated is the market right now? Is it reacting to macro factors such as the Fed, for example, or trade, or is it more differentiated?
You know, that's a great question, David. And when you come at it, like in an earnings season, it tends to be a little bit less correlated because you're reacting to the individual stock story. So for instance, today stocks are basically flat. Disney, we have popping higher because they put up a solid quarter, and the guidance is
on those movies. Those movies came through for Disney.
Yes, Avengers, Star Wars, and all these movies, and of course Disney Plus next week. But as we go out of earnings season, it'll probably become a little bit more correlated again, as it's simply more of the macro factor backdrop.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle. She always keeps us up to date on the markets. And right now, we're going to turn to Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warns that NATO risks becoming irrelevant. That's adding fuel to the criticism of the transatlantic alliance. Secretary Pompeo says NATO would lose significance if its 29 members don't contribute enough to the common defense. He made the comments on a visit to Berlin to mark the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Iran's air defense force has shot down what it's calling an unknown drone over the Persian Gulf. That's according to its state-run news agency. The report did not say whether the drone was a military or commercially available device. Local authorities claim the drone belonged to a foreign country and that parts of it had been recovered. They say it violated Iran's airspace. The United Nations highest court says it has jurisdiction in a case brought by Ukraine against Russia. The International Court of Justice will examine allegations that Russia breached treaties on terrorist financing and racial discrimination. The Kremlin's accused of arming rebels in eastern Ukraine and reining in the rights of ethnic minorities following its annexation of Crimea. The case could take years to settle. In Alabama, Jeff Sessions will run for the Senate seat he gave up to become President Trump's first attorney general. In a video, Sessions says he remains a strong Trump supporter despite, quote, our ups and downs. He resigned from the cabinet last year after months of insults from the president. Most had to do with Sessions' recusal from the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, the law of unintended consequences. Could Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax drive billionaires exactly where she doesn't want them to go? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax is making waves from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. The Democratic presidential candidate is doubling now her initial tax rate as a way to fund Medicare for all without raising taxes on the middle class, something she's promised not to do. But this could have some unintended consequences, benefiting, of all things, maybe, believe it or not, private equity, which Elizabeth Warren doesn't tend to like. Bloomberg's Brandon Kachkodan is now here with his story. So explain exactly why this might drive people toward private equity.
Yeah, so the idea was to look at, just assume this 6% is going to be a barrier. If you're not making more than 6%, your wealth is going to go down. So let's look at some capital market assumptions that are out there. We looked at GMO, we looked at BlackRock, JP Morgan, all the ones that are publicly available. And if you look at those, take it at 7 years, 10 years, there's sort of one game in town, and that's private equity if you want to surpass a 6% tax.
But won't they essentially evaluate whatever the value is of the private equity and impose the wealth tax on that valuation?
Sure, but the goal is beating that 6%, right? So, I mean, that's the option if you go by these capital market assumptions.
But under that analysis, the government would still get the money. She'd still have the money to pay for Medicare for all, so it doesn't come out of that. It's not really tax avoidance.
It's not tax avoidance. It's the idea of just where do you have to put your money, where do you have to reallocate some of your money to beat that 6%. It's
sort of a different form of a search for yield.
Exactly.
You need higher yield if they're going to take some of your wealth away.
Exactly, and that's why we sort of draw a comparison to looking at what endowments and pensions have been doing in a low interest rate environment in consideration of their own hurdle rates.
Brandon, does it suggest other sort of alternative investments? It's not just private equity, but things like real estate and other things that are somewhat riskier but particularly higher reward.
Certainly, and it depends on which capital market assumptions you're looking at. Some of them show other options, hedge funds, mezzanine real estate debt, things like that are also there. But private equity is the one that seems to be across the board that shows up above that 6% threshold.
Very interesting piece. Okay, thanks so much to Bloomberg's Brandon Kachkoda. Now, for more on policies and politics, for that matter, we welcome now our panel of OBrian Murray, founder of Red Barn Strategies and president of Accountable New York, and Basil Smikle. He's former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Well, so Basil, adjusted rate of return, though, is where that all comes back down to it, and they're going to find ways to move the money. They'll move it to other places where they don't get calculated on a regular basis, and maybe you put the money on day one. You don't know the value of your real estate until day 20, until year 20 at times. When you put your money in certain things, if there's no expiration date on these funds, that money can sit there and they won't get the money.
So Basil, let's turn to you on this. In this sense, there's a lot of uncertainty about all this stuff, right? But the one thing that seems to be clear is Elizabeth Warren is feeling some heat to make her numbers add up. That is because she keeps saying, I'm not going to tax the middle class. We're going to have Medicare for all. A lot of people are saying those numbers don't add up. Now she's doubled her rate, and she's saying we're going to find a way to tax all of you guys.
Yes. Now, being the political person in the room, I actually understood everything that was said earlier, and I would concur that if you have the ability to move your money, that is what's going to happen. So the challenge that Elizabeth Warren has faced is that, if you remember on the debate stage when she was asked how you would pay for your plan, she was not able to do that. So I don't want to say the rush, but for the sake of expediency, she does come out with this plan that I don't know is fully thought through. Having said all of that, I actually don't think that that's where most of the concern over her plan is going to be in terms of taxing the wealthy. It's not around that. It's around the folks that have private health care. Are they going to lose it? That is really where the conflict is right now.
But at the same time, do we want the government to take in more money and spend it? Who's better to spend our money? Ourselves or the government? And that's what this really comes down to. She's finding a way to spend more money for the government to control more of what we spend every day.
So you got two issues there, and I agree both of them with some voters who resonate. On the one hand, I don't want to give them my private insurance problem. On the other hand, do we really want the government controlling everybody's health care? At the same time, most people agree it is wrong that the number of people who are uninsured are insured. They don't get coverage. And thus far, the Republicans have not come up with a plan for universal coverage, however you do it.
There are many ways to try to do it, and you work on a state basis, but not the federal basis. I think that's what we're looking at now. You look, the states come up, the states determine what they can do. Why should the federal government come tell every state what they should do and how they should do it? That's part of it. The other thing is, what about all the men and women that work at these insurance companies? She wants to just throw them out in the street. What happens to all those companies and all those jobs? That's a part of this economy that isn't even being answered about when you put the wealth tax on and you move it over somewhere else.
We're here with OBrian Murray and Basil Smikle. Well, okay, fine, OBrian, but part of the answer to why the federal government is the states haven't done it. We've been doing this for a long time, and we have millions and millions of Americans who do not have health coverage.
But if the states aren't doing it, maybe that's the reason on the local level they don't want the government to control it. They want to try to find out what they can do, and they want to get people out of the emergency rooms.
Let me go to that point, because on issue after issue, whether it's healthcare or education, which is what I do in study and research, the states have always asserted their rights against the federal government to promote their own policies. That is true. But when has the federal government stepped in? When there's been a national interest, whether it's been in the New Deal, whether it was through, the Great Society, in terms of ending poverty, the federal government has stepped in.
You're the guy with a PhD. I believe that part.
And when it comes to education, the GI Bill.
And the GI Bill.
Enormous infrastructure in education was built up on the GI Bill.
So there is an appetite for this.
There is
There's an appetite for this, and I think there is a growing consensus that capitalism as we know it is not working for everybody. And if we can chip away at healthcare.
But why is there such a backlash on Warren's plan? Part of it is because they don't want it. That's what you're saying. They're going too far.
Well, no, but
they did Obamacare.
It's not exactly that, though.
How are they going to pay for it? It's ideal for everyone to have a car in their garage. But if you can't afford a house, why do you don't have a garage? You don't have a car.
But part of the point is there are objections to Elizabeth Warren's plan. No question about it. You two have just illustrated two of them. But that doesn't mean there isn't a problem to be addressed. And are the Republicans proposing any way to address it, other than just keep kicking the can down the road?
I think it's much more about the state rights. It really is at this point. The federal government has grown too much. We saw this Obamacare. We saw what happened there. We had a tax on people who couldn't afford insurance to help say, just let's tax them, even though you can't afford insurance. And that's a solution, too. That was the Obamacare problem that got thrown out.
I'll just say very quickly, there is no alternative that the Republicans are putting forward. They hate Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act has proven to be a very resilient piece of legislation, and that's what we're hearing from both Democrats and Republicans right now. Healthcare is on the top of their list.
But that was all passed with Democratic votes at that point, too. It was not a bipartisan effort, and that's part of the challenge here.
But is it unfair, Obi, to say that, in fact, when the Republicans went after the Affordable Care Act, they paid the price in the midterm elections?
There was an issue, no question about it. They did it because they found one tweak in there that's very important, the pre-existing conditions. But it took the Democrats that many years to do it. That should have been taken care of. The Republicans had the wrong message at that point. But that does not mean the whole health care plan has to be changed and brought back to where Elizabeth Warren wants it.
Obi, let me ask a pointed question. What happened to the suburbs on Tuesday? For Republicans in Philadelphia,
right here we
in Richmond. What happened to the suburbs for Republicans?
Hempstead, Long Island, we won that. Yorktown, up in Westchester, we won that. You're 100% right. In certain parts of this country, no question about it. But you look at it, you can't. All politics is local. We can't beat somebody with nobody. But Matt Slater up there in Yorktown is going great, and Don Clavin out in Hempstead. You saw those. You saw two Democrat incumbents right here in New York.
All I would say. Momentum. That's it.
Okay.
That is the word of the day.
Sure.
We had a good day, and interestingly enough, if you just look very specifically at the Democratic primary, those results actually helped Joe Biden. There are a lot of his voters, those older voters, suburban voters, that he has tied to his electability argument.
Yeah, but momentum is obviously very important in politics. Do you have the standard bearer to take you there? Is it Elizabeth Warren? Is it Joe Biden?
That's the unknown question right now, because I always tell voters, anger only gets you to 49%. Being angry at Donald Trump is one thing. We have to actually embrace our candidate to get to 51%. But we haven't gotten that candidate yet.
Maybe it takes only 49%. I think President Trump has gotten a long way on anger. It's helped him a lot. It's
motivation and excitement. That's what it brings. That's what it brings. It brings momentum. It brings motivation. People have a reason to go to the polls. That's what a lot of it is. I think what we're talking about here too is when people are demotivated to go to the polls, when they don't have an excitement about somebody, when they're voting against somebody, they're less likely to go vote. That's one of the challenges there.
People right now feel like they're pretty excited. Okay, particularly right here. This is very exciting. Okay. Many thanks to our panel of OBrian Murray and Basil Smyko. Great conversation. Still ahead, President Trump versus vaping, the president's latest proposal to address a national epidemic. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. Time now for the stock of the hour. Today we're looking at tobacco company Altria, which is trading slightly higher today, even after President Trump said that he will be raising the age limit for vaping. Kaylee Lentz is here to explain. So it's clear there's an epidemic, particularly in teenagers in this country. Is it hurting Altria because of vaping?
Well, it definitely has. I mean, reminder, Altria has a 35% stake in Juul, and at the time when they bought it last December, it was worth almost $13 billion. They've since had to take more than a $4 billion write-down because Juul has lost so much market share in the height of this vaping crisis, really, as you allude to. I mean, when you look at the statistics, especially as to how popular it is among the youth, University of Michigan did a study, like your alma mater, I just realized that.
Go blue,
but when you look, 12th graders, 25% of them last month were vaping. For 11th graders, 20%. And those rates are more than double what they were back in 2017. So obviously this is really taking hold among young people, especially the flavors. Now, to give Juul some credit here, they are taking action. They're trying to kind of make nice with public opinion and with regulators. Like just yesterday, they decided they're not going to sell the mint pods anymore because those are really popular among younger vaping users. But that's also almost 2/3 of their pod sales. So they're taking a financial hit here.
And the FDA, rumor is the FDA may get into this and say you can only sell ones that taste like tobacco or menthol. But this was part of a diversification effort by Altria. If this doesn't work out, what's plan B?
So it's interesting. They have tried to diversify in a number of ways. They also have a stake in Cronos, which is a Canadian cannabis company. But I think if Juul doesn't work out, what actually may gain some more traction is IQOS, which they have the exclusive rights to market in the U.S. It's Philip Morris.
What is that? I don't know what IQOS is.
Philip Morris is a tobacco heater, so it doesn't burn and it's not a vape. So it's kind of an alternative to both traditional tobacco cigarettes that burn and to the likes of Juul, which are vaping products. And that actually has started to really take hold. They're now marketing it in the U.S. Remember, Altria decided not to merge with Philip Morris earlier this year. They were once together. They came apart, decided not to come back together again, in part because of how much hysteria was around vaping. But now they do still have the rights to market that product. So that may be the way forward here.
It's truly interesting. Thank you so much, Kaylee. Great reporting. That's Kaylee Lentz. Coming up, The View from Kyiv. We're live at Ukraine's capital for a read on how the impeachment inquiry is affecting the country Congress was trying to help. Global affairs analyst Michael Pasirko joins us next. This is Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, Boeing thought it was close to finishing a software redesign for its grounded 737 MAX jet over the summer, but problems with simulated flights delayed the planned relaunch for months. Bloomberg has learned that a simulated computer glitch caused the plane to dive aggressively. It resembles the problem that had caused a pair of deadly crashes months earlier. Boeing was forced to overhaul the plane's flight computers. President Trump is set to rewrite the rules on vaping. In remarks at the White House today, he announced plans for new regulations on e-cigarettes and vaporizers in the United States.
We're going to be coming out with a very important position on vaping. We have to take care of our kids, most importantly. So we're going to have an age limit of 21 or so. But we'll be coming out with something next week.
Meanwhile, the head of the White House Domestic Policy Council, Joe Grogan, calls the FDA's regulation of tobacco, quote, a huge waste of time. He says the agency should focus on approving and monitoring new drugs. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has appointed hardline politician Naftali Bennett as defense minister in his caretaker government. Netanyahu's move appears aimed at shoring up opposition to attempts by his chief rival to form Israel's next government. Benny Gantz is trying to piece together a majority coalition government after inconclusive elections in September. Netanyahu has since tried and failed to do so. Lawyers for Brazil's former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva have begun legal procedures requesting his release from prison. The move follows a Supreme Court decision that a person can be imprisoned only after all appeals to higher courts have been exhausted. Lula has been detained since April of 2018 after being convicted of corruption. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. We have a Bloomberg scoop right now. Carl Icahn is said to plan a proxy fight at Occidental Petroleum. Remember that Mr. Icahn has been very critical of the CEO of Occidental Petroleum and the management there, thinking about their major acquisition, what they've been doing. And now it appears that he may be following through on his criticism by actually launching a proxy fight. You can see the stock of Occidental Petroleum on the news is up about 2% now. So it's responding to the news that Carl Icahn is planning a proxy fight to take over control of Occidental Petroleum. Now I want to turn back to Ukraine. We've seen a transcript of one call that President Trump had with Ukraine President Zelensky. Now it turns out there's a second call and a second transcript coming from last April. Mr. Trump now says that he's willing to release that transcript as well. It may be hard to remember through all this that this came about because Congress was actually trying to help Ukraine by providing it with military aid. For the perspective from Ukraine, we welcome now global affairs analyst Michael Persirku. Over the telephone, he is a former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Welcome, Michael. It's great to have you back with us. We don't hear much from how this all looks from Ukraine's point of view, what this has done to Ukraine. Give us really what it means for President Zelensky and the government over there.
Mm-hmm. Hi, David. Good to be with you. Well, I can tell you on the surface here, everything is really quite calm, but Zelensky was out very early this morning speaking at the Kiev International Economic Forum, ahead of Jack Ma, by the way, and he was basically pumping up the country, giving it the typical promotion that it's, a lot of IT skills, things like this. But I can tell you, speaking to a lot of sources and diplomats here, there's real chaos inside the administration of how to deal with his erratic Trump foreign policy and also with the widening scandal coming out of Washington. The big problem they have here, of course, is on the one hand, they're trying to promote Ukraine as a new investment destination and so on. But on the other hand, I've said this time and time again, every time Trump and his inner circle open their mouths about Ukraine, they describe it as a kind of cesspool of corruption. So it's very, very difficult without having a specific strategy to overcome that day-to-day barrage of bad PR.
So, Michael, I want to come back to the corruption issue in a moment, but first let's talk about exactly what gave rise to all this. As I understand it, it was military aid being provided by the United States because Ukraine, of course, does have a large Russian bear that sometimes can flex its muscle over there. Is the military aid flowing now from the United States, and what is the security situation with respect to Ukraine?
Right. Yes, the aid is flowing. Of course, these things take some time because don't forget a lot of this aid was for the lethal weapons, which Ukraine has been begging for a long time, including under the Obama administration. But, there's going to have to be capacity building, that sort of thing going on with military. At the moment, as we speak, it's an extremely sensitive time. I can't overemphasize it because there are four-party talks right now involving Ukraine, Russia, and European partners to bring finally peace to eastern Ukraine. Now, there have been two kind of mini ceasefires and disengagements that have been successful. But because it's such a sensitive topic here in Ukraine of basically granting possibly semi-autonomy to the areas of Ukraine occupied by the Russian rebels, that Zelensky seems to be backtracking a bit and going slower. If I can add one more quick thing, it's always been the case, always in negotiations with Russia, is that Ukraine has always counted on the backing of the United States diplomatically, military, and of course with NATO. But that seems to be slipping away under the Trump White House, and there's a lot of anxiety about what to do next.
We're talking with Michael Bashirko. He's the global affairs analyst. He's coming to us on the telephone, actually from Kyiv over in Ukraine. Let's turn back to that question of corruption, because to some extent that also gave rise to this exchange that we know about between President Trump and President Zelensky, a perception that there has been corruption in Ukraine. As I remember, when President Zelensky was elected, he was a bit of an outsider, who wasn't expected to be, wasn't part of his campaign actually to address that corruption. Is he doing that?
Well, you're right. It was the main campaign platform, too. There were two planks. One was to bring peace to Eastern Ukraine, and then the other one was to drain the swamp. He actually loves to use Trump's term, and clean up corruption. Of course, easier said than done in a place like this where it's basically controlled by a lot of crooked oligarchs, and the system has been in place for quite some time. But slowly, progress is being made. I don't think international donors or the general public are pleased at the pace. They'd like things to move quicker. But I have to say, ironic is it not, that in this whole call that you referred to with the between Trump and Zelensky, that was actually Trump kind of suggesting to Zelensky to be corrupt and to, as a favor, put these Biden associates under investigation. So it's a real big problem for this new administration. They're basically dealing with a president who is dealing with foreign policy as if he'd be dealing with a casino transaction in Atlantic City, a kind of mobster mentality, pressuring people, being very transactional. So not easy at all.
So Michael, where does Ukraine think it can get foreign direct investment from? Where is it looking to? Is it China? Is it Europe? Where are they looking to?
Well, really all over, especially the United States. Technology today and in many other fora I've attended here is the big buzzword. There are so many engineers, tech specialists graduating every year. So the talent is here. The costs are low. Energy costs, as Jack Ma pointed out today, are very low. But the problem is you also have a huge brain drain. A lot of people leaving for either better salaries or that first or second stage funding. The other big thing here, and China is looking at it, is agriculture, pork, wheat. But also, as we speak, China is trying to still push a purchase of a huge aerospace engine manufacturing here in Ukraine. It's called Motor Seats. They produce engines for helicopters and for aircraft. The United States is blocking that because they think that this technology may be put to bad uses and maybe it's unsold to Russia, that sort of thing. So Ukraine, as it kind of matures and grows up, it's getting caught in these kind of geopolitical struggles, even debates over 5G and whether Huawei should be allowed in. So not an easy path to navigate for such a young presidency.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for being with us. Always helpful to have you here. That's Global Affairs Analyst Michael Bashirko reporting from Ukraine. Coming up, turning the screws on big tech. One of President Trump's big supporters in Silicon Valley discusses what Congress is getting wrong with possible tech regulation. Sun Microsystems co-founder Scott McNealy joins us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. President Trump doesn't seem to have too many friends in Silicon Valley these days, but our next guest, who describes himself as a raging capitalist, has been an outspoken and consistent supporter of the president and his agenda, even throwing him a fundraiser earlier this fall. And he's concerned about how Congress is approaching potential regulation of the tech sector. Welcome now, Scott McNealy, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems. He also sits on the board of Rex, technology-driven residential real estate brokerage, and joins us today from Palo Alto for our conversation in chief. So welcome, Mr. McNealy. Good to have you with us. Let's start with Rex. Explain to us exactly what Rex is.
Well, I've had a career of disrupting lots of industries, including the computer industry and all of the industries that we disrupted with technology, especially broker-based industries where you can go do things online. And one of the last places that hasn't been disrupted is the whole real estate, residential real estate market with real estate agents, and it's very, very fragmented and very low tech and very expensive. And in fact, the 6% fees that you use to you have to pay when you sell your house is among the highest in the world and hasn't changed in many, many years, even though on the buyer side, most of the buyers are using the online environment, virtual searching, all the rest of it, doing a lot of the work that the real estate agent used to do for them now can be done online. And on the seller side, there's very little work that's been done to solve all the other problems of where do I get my loans and my mortgages and my title and insurance, and where do I get the pool boy, and how do I move my stuff, all the rest of it. So Rex is basically hiring tons of engineers. I know specifically, I get a report every day. My Stanford computer scientist is working there, and there's a really great and strong team building out AI, machine learning, big data, and they're using all that analysis to basically lower the cost to 2% versus the 5 to 6% that people are paying to sell their house, and using all of this big data and analysis. You know, you think about a real estate agent, they don't really share their data with their company because that's their secret gold. So you got one person's little database. At Rex, we're going global and deep and into all parts of knowledge about school systems and commutes and where people are moving, and we can do targeted advertising of people who are going through some life change that would create a need. We have so much more information and can drive that into as much lower cost. We're gonna basically turn that whole industry upside down.
So Scott, you said it right at the top that you were a disruptor of sorts. How do you go about disrupting an entire industry? How do you market it? How do you get the word out? How do you dislodge existing relationships?
Well, I get on TV here to one of the most famous TV stations ever, Bloomberg, and share. Everybody should go to the Rex website and check and sell your house on it or buy your house. I'm listing my house on it, for instance. It's a great way to go. The second thing we do is we raise a lot of capital, and we've raised over $75 million of capital. Third, we've got an unbelievable board of advisors on this company with people from McDonald's and Google and a whole bunch of other really, really talented people who are helping us drive this out into the market. And then word of mouth is just getting out there. This thing is growing very quickly, and we've opened up in just about all of the major markets in the United States. So it's growing very quickly. The market's going to tip to this kind of an environment. We think we're going to be the market recipient of that tippage, if you will.
and you and your fellow tech people have taught us new words such as the network effect and things like that. As a result, we've got some tech companies who've gotten awfully big. Maybe Rex will get that big someday. But we've got the Alphabets or Googles of this world. We've got Facebook and things like that. There's a lot of push for regulation back here. And in fact, some people like Facebook said there should be some form of regulation. Where are you on that? Do we need the government to have some structure put around the big tech companies?
Well, I just, if the government's here to help, I cringe, and I've become much more of a small government person the older I get, and I've watched the federal budget, for instance, go from $70 billion when I was born to $4.7 trillion next year. I think we need to cut back on regulation. I think Congress moves at the speed of Congress, not at the speed of the internet, and I think they'll get it wrong. I don't want to see private companies being managed and free speech being managed by the government through private companies. So I've not been a favorite of breaking up Facebook. That's not the issue. I don't think, I said a long time ago, you have no privacy, get over it, and that tweaks people in a lot of different ways. It's the truth. But I don't believe if you're getting a free product like from Facebook that you're the customer, you are the product in that space, and you shouldn't have an expectation that your data is going to be free. I tell my boys, I have 4 boys, anything that gets captured digitally with you involved in it, whether you do it or somebody takes it, becomes a digital tattoo and very, very hard to erase. The only people that have ever been able to erase anything is the 30,000 Clinton emails. That's the only thing I know of that's actually gotten erased on the internet. But breaking it up is not going to be the problem. And trying to regulate, I always get frustrated with the phrase hate crime. What's a hate crime? How do you define that? I think a crime is hateful no matter what, no matter what level. It's different levels of hateful. How do you define that? And I don't want the government, we have freedom of speech, and I think we need to get the political discourse off of social and onto a more neutral site. And I've suggested to multiple people that we need to create the equivalent of NPR public broadcasting system
or BBC
for that political conversation, something that's a .org and independent and open.
Right. We're talking with Scott McNealy. He's co-founder of Sun Microsystems. Let's put aside regulation of the content of speech for a moment, Scott, and talk about innovation, because one of the concerns that's been expressed is that, in fact, if you get too big, actually it really curtails innovators from coming up behind and competing with you. That certainly was expressed in the old trusts. If you go back to Standard Oil and some of the real concerns about monopolization, that was the concern. There's no opportunity. Are you seeing any of that? Are you seeing a curtailing of innovation and success?
That's a great question, and I think it's a pertinent question, because really, what does Facebook really keep me from doing in my life? Well, you know, there's lots of ways to take a picture of my dinner and share that. So I'm not feeling like I have freedom or loss of choice on where to post a picture of my dessert. And I have lots of ways of communicating to people. And the people that might be upset that they have very little choice are advertisers, because digital advertising is three-fourths of it is Google and Facebook, and they're gaining share. So they might have a beef, but the consumer, you know, you don't have to use Facebook, you don't have to use Twitter, you don't have to use Google products. I don't use the Google browser, for instance. So you can survive. I don't think innovation is stopped in biotech or in autonomous vehicles or anything because of those companies. So I think innovation continues to truck. So I don't think that's a big issue.
Okay, Scott, I really appreciate you being with us. It's very interesting. It's Scott McNealy. He's co-founder of Sun Microsystems. Coming up here, the fall of the wall. We head to Berlin as Germany confronts big challenges 30 years after a pivotal moment in history. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
The Berlin Wall comes down. Germany unified for the first time since World War II. But the cost of integrating the former Soviet satellite state doesn't come cheap.
Growth picks up, industrial production takes off, and Germany becomes the dominant economy of Europe, and in some sectors, the world. Volkswagen, BMW, Siemens, BASF, to name a few, at the heart of the machine. January 1st, 1999, the euro is born, with the European Central Bank headquartered in Frankfurt.
Berlin loses its beloved Deutschmark, but Germany becomes the chief beneficiary of the common currency.
As German economic might grows, problems are emerging. The euro region debt crisis, an increasingly hostile Russia, the immigration crisis, Dieselgate, Brexit, and of course the U.S.-China trade war, sapping Germany's export dominance. Manufacturing collapses, exports slide, and Germany teeters on the edge of its first recession in more than 6 years. With Merkel in the twilight of her power, Germany Inc. struggling to restore its preeminence, pressure builds on the government to spend its way out of the economic malaise. The question is, even if the fiscal taps are opened,
will it be enough to prime the one-time engine of Europe?
That was Bloomberg's Matt Miller reporting from Berlin, as you could see, to take a look at Germany's journey since the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago and to preview what is still to come. Let's welcome now Bloomberg's Birgit Jenen, coming to us from Berlin. So Birgit, welcome. Good to have you here. Give us a sense. It was quite an undertaking to put these two countries, because they were separate countries effectively, together. How much progress have they made in 30 years?
I mean, Germany is one country. One has to keep this in mind. I mean, we have one language, and that obviously helps integration massively. But one has to say, economically, when you travel through the East now, you see that the country has massively changed. The high unemployment, which we saw just right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, has come down. The differences in unemployment aren't that high anymore. And you can see that wealth is triggering through to the East. But what has not been achieved is sort of a unified society. East and West people are still feeling somewhat apart, and particularly with Eastern Germans, they feel somehow left behind. And this comes together with the trend of globalization. You don't get big international companies, which we just mentioned here. They're just not based in East Germany. They're all still based in West Germany. So East Germans are still somehow feeling left behind, and they still feel sort of that the West is somewhat dictating where it's going.
One of the things that we watch carefully with the politics in Germany is the rise of populism. And that has certainly been a challenge, I think it's fair to say, for Chancellor Angela Merkel. Is there a difference in the degree of populism between what was the West and what was the East?
Yeah, I do think there is a difference. I mean, basically, the East hasn't had that experience of immigration, obviously, because it was a closed country. So, so even with just a limited number of refugees entering the East, it is almost too much for them to cope at the moment. It's because combined with this feeling of being left behind, the only bit they're getting from globalization, that's the feeling, is the refugees. And so, and they have the feeling that somehow the refugees get more than what they got after reunification. And this is why certain xenophobia is building up in the East, and yes, is dividing the country.
Yeah, quickly, Birgit, finally, it strikes me that Angela Merkel herself is from the East. Has that made a difference?
I mean, it hasn't made a big difference. Angela Merkel has never made a big issue out of being from the East. She was aware that in order to be a successful chancellor, which she has been over the last 14 years, she has to make sure that she's representing the whole of Germany. And she, if she would have made a thing out of being an East German, the West Germans wouldn't have liked that. So she always played that somewhat down. Just now, at the end of her tenure, she's actually making a big, much more of a speech about this. She's coming out more and says that East Germans actually need to have more say in the country.
Okay, thank you so much, Birgit. Really appreciate the reporting from Berlin. That's Bloomberg's Birgit Jenen over in Berlin. Coming up, the Sudafed solution. We study a new plan to keep e-cigarettes away from kids. Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg.